Okay, great. Yes, so we're exploring this line from these 4 phrases, which is direct pointing to the mind. And the way we're going to explore that is just by asking a few questions, a few questions that will help us clarify this. So the first question is, well, how do we point directly to the mind? Then we'll ask, what is the mind? And why do we have to do that so directly? And then we'll see where we get to. So how to point directly to the mind? The reason I'm asking this, I think this bears a little bit of recap, because I said earlier that these phrases are sequential. So we'll just do a kind of the journey from the first phrase to this one, which is, so the first phrase is special transmission outside the scriptures. And it's like with the first 2 phrases, the sequence is asking us to discard something. So a special transmission outside the scriptures. Okay, so we need to move away from the scriptures, the Buddhist canon, all of the learning, the written texts, including the oral tradition. So it's endorsing that. And it doesn't mean throw it away. It doesn't mean that study is rubbish, not to be done. It's saying that there's a subtler communication that can only be had outside of the scriptures, and that we have to dispense with our usual way of communicating the Dharma if we want to go deeper. And that's probably on the basis of some understanding already. We referred to this very subtle and beautiful direct communication between the Buddha and one of his chief disciples. I'll read you that, a description by Bhante of that. So in the story, the Buddha held up a flower, and it was a deep communication. Kashyapa, Mahakashyapa, his mind was freed by that gesture. And so Bhante says, when the Buddha held up the golden flower, not when he spoke, which was only for the benefit of the other disciples who had failed to understand the significance of this action, there took place a direct communication of truth from one mind to another, from a supremely enlightened mind to one that was almost so, and needing only the most delicate of touches to bring it to perfection. So we looked quite a lot last week about this story, and I love that this idea of the most delicate of touches to bring it to perfection. Then the next phrase is no dependence on words and letters, so that it's almost underlining the first point, making sure we really get it, that we've got to move away from some kind of superficial intellectual pursuit of Buddhism. Here's the Buddha. The spiritually immature person wins theoretical religious knowledge only to his own disadvantage. It destroys his better nature while splitting his head. So that's from the Buddha's own words, and this is what the Zen tradition is pointing at. This underlining this, we have the explicit endorsement to not depend on book learning. It doesn't depend on accumulation of knowledge. It's interesting that there are many professors in Buddhist universities who understand Buddhist philosophy to very, very great degrees, and have far-ranging thoughts, insightful with a small I, thoughts about Buddhism. And many of them aren't Buddhists, so that their level of knowledge may extend very far. It may extend this way, but it's not going this way. It's not reaching depths, and it's not reaching heights. It's not impacting their belief. That indicates a limit. In Buddhism, I think this is something that we quite often emphasize in this class, that the levels of knowledge, or they're called the 3 levels of wisdom, are really important. And the first level is listening, and that's making ourselves available to hear teachings. Yeah, so like in a way, this is why on Dharma Night we often have meditation before going into more discussion. Is we're letting the mind settle, so that there's space for something to go in at a basic level, a basic level of comprehension. So actually, I'll just say a few things about the 3 levels of the wisdom. The first 2 levels, so there's listening, reflecting, realizing. The first 2 are the only active ones. So this is where we can put effort in. So in order to listen well, we can put down, like we've been talking about, withdrawing from external things. We can put them down. The image for that is becoming like an empty pot. So our preoccupations don't fill the pot. Our own opinionatedness isn't kind of overflowing the pot. We can receive teachings. And we do that actively. The second, actually, there's probably a bit more to say about that. Just Bante's quite pointed about how we abuse our minds. He says we treat our minds like dustbins, and this was before the internet age, yeah. So it's a habit, but now we've got this kind of this situation where that's very, very difficult to overcome. So he treats our minds like we treat our minds like dustbins, indiscriminately absorbing anything chucked in our direction. And not only that knowledge is indirect, so it's second hand. We learn things that people tell us. We absorb other people's opinions. We're not coming into we're not all of the things that we absorb, particularly through social media, but also in the old days it would have been the newspapers, magazines, books, etc. It's mediated through at least one other person, and we forget to check in with our own experience. We forget to notice that we are experiencing all of the time. Never mind the quality of what we're consuming. The fact is that we're often in a consuming mode. So the first level is listening. It is clearing our minds of emptying the dustbin really, and letting our minds discern what's of value to absorb. This quality of listening. And then we reflect on the meaning of what we hear. So that's the second, that's reflecting. And this is active as well. We decide to do that. We chew it over on the way home on the tube. You might just sort of go over what's going on, what you've heard at Dharma Night. There's lots of ways to reflect, and it depends on sort of how you can be quite inventive about it. You can turn it over in your mind. You can write. Lots of people process things through journaling, writing notes, going over the notes, discuss it with Dharma companions. We might even draw images if you work like that. That's something that really works for me, is to, if I can translate concepts into images, then I find them much easier to digest. Or you could write, you can write a poem if you like after Dharma Night tonight. So we engage it with it personally, not just abstractly, but personally. Reflect on it in as you. How does it affect your life? So that's the reflecting. So that's also active, yeah. And then the realizing is when that effort of listening and reflecting has an effect, and it can feel like a kind of grace, because the realizing, you can't will yourself to realize. You can't just decide, I'd like to be awakened. Yeah, I'd really like it. Oh, yeah. It worked. Realizing is when we are so affected by what we've absorbed that we cannot help but change. Yeah. So it's like when we see a whole truth, we become part of that truth. We can't actually resist it. Does that make sense? Like once you've seen something, the only response is to change, and realizing is like that. It's not something that you need to make effort to do. The effort comes in the first two parts. Yeah, so we see the truth so naturally, so fully that we naturally align with it, and that is demonstrated in that example with the Buddha and Mahakāshyapa. Is like the flower was held up, and Mahakāshyapa didn't think, I wonder what the Buddha's teaching is. Could be this, could be that. Something was shown and something was seen in the same instant, and that affected a huge change. It's got realization's got this is of the nature of spontaneity. And one of the others a sort of discernible, methodical application of effort. So this is how we start to look at the mind. We change our mode of communication, and we dispense with all of the kind of rubbish that we have preoccupying us. We make efforts to make our minds available so that we can actually see the mind. So when you were talking about your meditation, I don't know what was said, but what you realise, start looking at the mind, is that it has so many aspects. It feels like, my mind just feels like me all the time, but actually sometimes it feels like more like me, like heavy, like, oh God, this is me again. And sometimes it feels different, that there are other qualities to me, but there's always a sense of, oh, this is me. Yeah. So maybe let's just explore a little bit, like what we mean by mind. And I was just reflecting. This is just a kind of list of things that I came up with around the mind and its capacities and its limitations. So our minds consist of, our thoughts, our ideas about ourselves. It also consists of dreams. That happens with the mind, doesn't it? Memories, compulsions. So if you pay attention to your mind, you'll notice habitual modes that you get into that you can't seem to, even though your better self says no, you can't seem to go into to stop doing that. So that's our mind. It's our emotional life, which is, the more you become a Buddhist, the more vivid your emotional life becomes, the dislikes as well as the likes. So it's all at the range from adoration and open-heartedness to terrible anger or hatred or aversion. All of that, we've all experienced all of that with the same mind, with apparently the same mind. And the fluctuations that we experience, especially, you notice this on retreat much, much more. In fact, this is one of the amazing things about having very habitual and quiet conditions, is that you see the fluctuations of your mind, and you see them as your mind, because the same thing's happening over and over again. The routine is the same, so you can't blame externals for it. So on a retreat, you have this whole day, you might have an hour actually just full of mental dramas. This happened and I was despair, and then I saw this, and now I feel great, and then I had this amazing meditation and I never thought I would. So all of that can happen in a very short amount of time, the same mind. And it's interesting, I've got friends who work in the charity shop down the road, Lama's Pyjamas, who say the same thing about the working in that shop. That it's the routine. You start at the same time every day, and you often meet the same customers. So it's a local shop with a lot of regulars. And my friend was saying how she's really managed to notice how it's her mind, how she responds to people. And sometimes people can be quite demanding. Sometimes people go into the shop for reasons other than buying second-hand jumper. And she can really see that some days she's really happy to see someone and patient with them, and other days she just feels very intolerant and just wants to hide out the back and do the sorting. And that's not to do with the external conditions, that's to do with the fluctuations of our minds, our positive and negative, the waves of positivity and negativity. And you might have done your own explorations of like what is the mind and what's amazing. Like I find it quite interesting. Memory, like when you know something but you can't quite find it, and it's like, well, where is that? You sort of roughly know the shape of it. It begins with H. And then you realise, oh, it's impetus. I meant to say impetus, but it doesn't begin with H, but anyway, or, and that transition from not remembering a word to suddenly it's there. Where did that come from? And what's going on beneath? There's all this stuff going on beneath. Memories with closed doors to them, but other subconscious. And that really shows itself in dreams. Buddhists take dreams very seriously, as an activity of the mind, as part of our life, really. I think anyone who's interested in the activities of the mind is interested in dreams. They show us something. Well, they show us what's going on in the mind when the will is not involved. Yeah, so that's why they're important, because we can't, unless we're actively doing lucid dreaming, but we're not getting involved and directing the activities of the mind. So then these images come and they speak to us, and we have to acknowledge them. And if you have a dream just before you wake up that's difficult or uneasy, it will stay with you, won't it, for quite a few hours. Or even like a beautiful dream can be like a gift, and it doesn't feel like we did anything for that to happen. So lots and lots of levels of mind, and even or intuitions, or you start to start to know things sometimes you know things without knowing them. So for instance, I was walking along this road and I realised I had an image of my father having a heart attack, and then the next morning I found out around that time he'd had a heart attack. And the mind can find things with no clues. I don't know where that came from, but the mind is very mysterious. That sort of thing is not that important. What is important, I think, that my mind can also go from feeling alienated and separate to, or even aversive to other people, to feeling really connected and really open to other people. And of course it can go back again, but there's always this possibility that the mind can go from, or my mind can feel defended and justified in its defence, to dropping that, and the quality of feeling connected or loving towards somebody is so different, isn't it, to not, or to feeling defensive or something like that. So I thought we could just have another little conversation between you. We'll get into pairs again. And the question I want to ask is that, when have you experienced your mind in a different way? So it doesn't need to be sort of operatically different, but when have you noticed your mind having a different quality, say, to its normal day-to-day quality? So it might be a dream, it might be something that just happened this week. Is that enough of a direction? Is that enough? Does anyone want more from me? No. In terms of that question. Yeah. Okay. So let's just get into pairs, and we'll have just a couple of minutes each to discuss, just to share that. Just a minute more. Okay, so I'm doing my magic spell now, which is you'll all go from chattering away to complete silence when I ask you to share in the bigger group. So would anyone mind saying something that you were discussing? Like what were some examples of you experiencing your mind in a slightly different way to normal? Yeah, Charlie.
We were talking about, we've got like a big presentation or something in the next hour or something. It's like our mind, we're not able to think like we can in like everyday lives. It's like there's a slight anxiety, and like just reflecting on things will be a lot more difficult if it's not that presentation. Something's like constantly bringing us back, making us worried about like presenting, or it's like very sort of constricted in a way to that like one thing that's coming up, and it's not maybe as open as it could be in like everyday life.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So yeah. Yeah. There's a kind of pressure that feels like there's that's forcing your mind into one shape or something. Yeah. Yeah. And a lack of freedom to roam around other topics. Yeah. Thanks. Anything else? That's a good check shirt.
Yeah, just add to that, because that's interesting. We were discussing the idea of sort of like the nervous system and how, if you're trying to meditate, you're trying to be still, and your nervous system, you've got cortisol going around your body, and it's really hard. So it's like that thing of like the body and the mind kind of influencing each other, and how it could be really difficult sometimes. Like sitting in this room, it's really easy to be still, but if you're, for example, going to work or whatever, it's really hard to go and be present because you've got all of this kind of physiological things going on as well.
And which, like, what do you count as your ordinary everyday mind? The going to work, or sitting in here being still?
Well, I mean, it's that I kind of see them as the same mind but doing very different things. Kind of like playing characters. We're both teachers, so we're talking about how we have to play that role of being a teacher.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Thanks. Yeah, behind you.
Yeah, I would add to that. My point was, in a calm social setting, our kind of brains do work very differently. So I think we're biochemically designed to be social, or we've evolved to be biochemically sort of social. The brain will secrete kind of immunoglobulin G or different.
So, but what about your experience?
That was
Something,
my experience
yeah.
the other week with family. Was my example of your brain relaxes in a very different way, I think.
Well, being with family, something.
Something. Go and see my brother and his family and stuff.
And that was pleasurable, or?
Yeah, it was really relaxing and really fun.
Yeah, great. And anything else?
I was talking about dream life.
Yeah.
And I was saying that particularly when I've done solitary retreats, having very, very strong dreams, but dreams that sort of felt like they were of a slightly different order from my ordinary dreams. So it seems to happen within my mind.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel like things that happened in dreams, they weren't things that I was in touch with on a day-to-day level. It felt much more sort of magical or mythical.
Yeah. That's wonderful when that happens, and it's interesting, isn't it? Like even dream life has its there's ordinary dream life, and then there's something else.
My mum turned up and she was a cabbage, and then
childhood friend, teacher, yeah.
Wake up, God, I was talking about a dream that I had that just left me absolutely really in quite in awe. Like I woke up feeling like, oof,
Yeah.
And it had happened. It felt like it had happened in my mind, in inverted commas.
Yeah.
But it was more like I stepped into something in the dream. So.
Yeah. Thanks, Akash Moshe. That's really beautiful, and things like experiences like that. And I think meditation can give us dollops of that as well, where it's like, well, that did happen to me, but it wasn't the kind of mind that I'm used to, and that I'm used to, and I think it can give us a sense of vision. So Bhante often talks about vision. It's like that is a possibility for our minds to be more in that, and as we practice more, our mind becomes more available for those like awesome. I think you described it as states of awe. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah, Dorota.
I feel like when I meditate a lot and when I go on a retreat and then this meditation kind of gathers those hours kind of come together, and like a texture of my mind, the frequency is different for many months afterwards. I would like to stay with it, but you have to go on another retreat or like really have a regular practice and make space, and it's like really hard. But I just wanted to say that also when I do art, like I'm on a pottery wheel, for example, it's just there's nothing else. You cannot think about anything else. You have to be centered.
Yeah.
And then everything else that is often spinning and overwhelming just slows down, and like really nice thoughts arise, and like slowing and pointing at what's really important sometimes comes.
Yeah.
So it's quite interesting to focus on making, and the cortisol level someone mentioned also goes down, I think, and it feels, I feel more connected when I do art. I'm sure you can relate because you're an artist yourself.
Yeah. Well, I there's two really good points there. One is, I like what you say, the texture and frequency of your mind feels different after intensive periods of practice. And that's really to be treasured. And then I think there's a slightly separate point, like the kind of focus. It's interesting, some focus is stressful, isn't it? Like the presentation. I think what Charlie was evoking was this slightly stressful situation. Maybe not, maybe there's something exhilarating about it. But what you're describing, making a pot on the pottery wheel, seems quite a kind of integrated focus of like just coming down to something quite earthy, and I think it's really. I'll get to you, Talina, in a minute as well, because you had your hand up. But I think it's really important to notice what activities do give our minds a bit of a break, whether it's some people get it when they're running. When I run, I just kind of get into a lot of compulsive thinking, but for other people it gets them into a flow state. Or what is it that gives your mind a break from humdrum preoccupations, because that's your mind in a healthy state, and that's really important. Talina.
I was thinking, I was on solitary recently as well, and what I noticed was that after a few days, when I would sit down for meditation, I was kind of already at like what my peak might be in my day-to-day life in London, where like if I sort of work really hard in my meditation, I might get to a place where I feel a bit more still and calm. And what I noticed when I was alone and there was so much less stimulus is that my mind was just so soft. And like it made me realize that in comparison, my mind in this life is like a very choppy body of water, just like lots of things happening all the time. But that feels normal when I'm in it. And then when I was alone, it was like it was so quiet, and like the pauses between thoughts were much longer. And when the thoughts came, they were just more gentle and more kind and more quiet, and like that felt like the starting point. I'd sit down and I'd already be there. So then it just like from there it felt really fertile. But definitely the contrast between that and then coming back, and I was straight back to sort of like choppy ocean mode.
Great. So our external conditions have a great deal to do with how our minds are, and I know my thought. This is my mind not working. So I wanted to follow up something there. Hopefully it will come back. That was it. That I think we're too used to the mind. We're too comfortable with our minds in a not particularly good state, and part of practice is to become more comfortable with our mind in a good state and less comfortable with a choppy state. So I was ill for a little while quite recently, and sort of in the depths of that illness, I wasn't at work because I'd been sort of slowly getting more sick. Like a lot of my responsibility had been deployed to other people, and I found myself in this very peaceful, low-key state, which I never do in London. I go on retreat to get into that state, and it was the illness factor aside, I felt quite amazing in my mind because of all sorts of conditions had created this sense of coming from living from a very still and essentialized. I think that's it. A very simple and essentialized way. I couldn't take on more than I could, and I really thought I want to learn from this. But now I've got my energy back, and I'm like, going, yes, I'll do that. And I'm trying to sort of take that lesson with me, that there was something very profoundly lovely about that, which I wouldn't recommend being sick, but there are lessons we can learn from situations when our conditions change. I think other points to notice are, if we have something difficult happening, or if we have a loss, or probably if a birth of a baby, that not saying that's difficult, that sort of big life events that put us in touch with life and death, bereavement, you might just find your mind in a different space, put us in touch with what's important, and those are things to treasure. Even if we can't hold on to them, but they're there as somewhere to remember. So in a way, I don't really want to decide, I don't want to term what mind is, but we're talking about, Bhante talks about it as being our psyche, which I think is a good way of thinking about it. It's that's very inclusive, isn't it, our psyche? It's like our emotions, our interests, our cognitive abilities, our intellect, the unconscious, the subconscious, all of that. And the Buddhist word for it is chitta. Chitta means something like heart mind, which is brings the rational and the emotional together. So when we're talking about direct pointing to the mind, this is where we start. It's not where we end, but this is where we start. With this amazing fluctuating capacity of awareness that we have. And Buddhism would say, just to say that exploring the mind, the assumption is not that consciousness is, and self-awareness is not an accident of material, an accident of evolution. It's not the fact that a few proteins bumped into each other and had a sort of something. That consciousness is not a byproduct of life. Buddhism would say that consciousness is actually primary, and at the very least, when we're looking at the mind, we're looking not at matter, we're looking at the subjective end of experience, so mind other than matter. Although everything that we encounter, of course, there is nothing that we encounter that is not included in our minds. There's nothing in our experience there's nothing in experience that's not part of our mind. That if it was, then we wouldn't experience it. Yeah. So looking at the mind is fascinating, and maybe that's what I encourage you to do if you want to do anything from this evening, is just notice the different modes of your mind over the week and examine it. It's like, what is the mind? Just keep asking yourself. Around the same time as these 4 verses or phrases were coming into being in China, in Tibet, that there was something similar going on, a need to address the mind directly in Buddhism. I think it had come after a very, very expressive and kind of florid expression of Buddhism in the Mahayana, which was cosmic and expansive. And I think people were realizing, okay, that's amazing, this cosmic vision of Buddhism, but let's just now look at the mind. And the teacher, Milarepa, Tibetan, amazing figure, was doing the same thing as they were doing in China and in the Zen tradition. He was saying, look at the mind. And there's a very famous teaching where he bumps into a young shepherd boy who asks loads of questions about the mind, and Milarepa sends him off to examine the mind. It's called the Shepherd's Search for Mind, and it's beautiful. It's beautiful interactions between this Lama and this curious young guy who becomes his disciple. So one of the questions that the shepherd boy asks Milarepa, they just bump into each other on a Himalayan mountain. You don't get many other types of people on Himalayan mountains. I think you get shepherds, robbers, and yogis, and various interactions between them. So the shepherd boy asks Milarepa, is my mind one or many? Which is it's not the sort of question we ask ourselves, possibly. But then when you think about it, like what we've just discussed, it's quite a good question, isn't it? Like all of these strands of our mind, is my mind one or many? So Milarepa sends the shepherd boy off to look and examine the mind. And he says, he comes back to him and he reports this. He says, "Dear Lama, last night I tried to find out what my mind is and how it works. I observed it carefully and found that I have only one mind. Even though one wants to, one cannot kill this mind. However much one wishes to dismiss it, it will not go away. If one tries to catch it, it cannot be grasped. If you want it to remain, it will not stay. If you release it, it will not go. You try to see it, it cannot be seen. You try to understand it, it cannot be known. It is something illuminating, aware, wide awake, yet incomprehensible. And then Milarepa gives a teaching. Listen carefully, dear shepherd. What characteristic the mind is clinging to is the notion of a self. But if one looks carefully into this mind, one actually sees no self at all. If you can learn how really to observe this apparent nothing, then you'll find that something will be seen. Okay, so this is a deeper examination of the mind beyond all of it, beyond all of the sort of mundane experiences of it. A description of actually realizing something about the illuminated nature of consciousness that Milarepa is pointing his disciple to. What the Zen tradition is saying, the next question we need to ask, and the final question, actually it's not the final question, sorry, two more questions. What the Zen is, the question is, why point to the mind and nothing else? And it goes back to the Buddha. And the Buddha realized that when the Buddha realized when he started out on his spiritual quest that actually all of the external trappings of his life, nothing was going to meet his existential inquiry, that he had to learn to rely on his own mind and to rely on it and investigate it, that the answers to his questions were only going to come from that withdrawal from worldly demands and self-examination and a deepening of understanding of the mind, which is what started his spiritual quest. Bhante says, depend on your own mind. That is to say, depend on yourself, for psychologically speaking, the mind is the self. Don't look without, don't allow your attention to be distracted by the multiplicity of external phenomena. Look within. So how many of us give time to do that, really? To not be distracted by the multiplicity of external phenomena. Look within. And of course, and these might be the most important Buddhist words, or the most important words ever written, the Buddha said about the mind, experiences are preceded by mind, led by mind and produced by mind. If one speaks or acts with a impure mind, suffering follows, even as the cartwheel follows the hoof of the ox drawing the cart. If one speaks or acts with a pure mind, happiness follows like a shadow that never departs. And that's the opening lines of the Dhammapada, which is the most translated Buddhist text from the Buddha's time. And they're at the start because they're drawing attention to the emphasis that we all need to pay attention to, which is looking at our minds. Which means, I'm rounding up now, what that means is withdrawing projections of negativity onto other people, so taking responsibility, not going into blame. And it also means, and this is really important actually, that when we see beauty or goodness or something awesome, something wonderful, we let that be in relation to our own mind, and not just stay as something that we worship. So we don't look at the Buddha full of admiration and abase ourselves at his feet, and stay in that way. We admire the Buddha as Buddhists, and we realise that our own minds can become like the Buddha. So by withdrawing, how can I say this properly? If this quality of withdrawing from a really something really very positive is to say, and now let me integrate that. Let my mind become that, rather than relying on it externally. Yeah, we have to do that when we break up with someone, don't you? On a much lower level. It's like, if we're in a relationship and someone leaves us, and we have to say, okay, what did they bring for me in my life? Let me manifest that myself. And spiritually, we do that, but we don't remain distant and separate and worshipping. We know that our own minds can eventually become like the Buddha, and that's the work. That's why we're direct pointing at the mind. We're not direct pointing at the Buddha. We're direct pointing at our own minds. Yeah. And Bhante puts it quite strongly. He says it means that in the last resort, we have to satisfy our need for enlightenment by developing it within ourselves, rather than becoming parasitic on the Buddha's enlightenment. Yeah, so we manifest it, develop it within ourselves. Then very finally, why direct pointing? So we've looked at the mind, and we've looked at pointing to the mind, and what's the significance of the direct pointing? Well, Bhante says, referring everything back to the mind itself. Why and what mind? And it's the aspect of the mind that can become like a Buddha, the kind of consciousness that's so far from being self-referential is released from self-reference. So when we're saying that we're looking at the mind, we're not saying navel-gazing, we're not saying self-absorption, we're saying penetrating examination of the nature of mind. And this can lead to liberation, this can lead to a quality of freedom that we can't imagine. And we have to do this not in a roundabout way of looking at the mind, not circuitous routes, but through meditation, through sitting without external stimulus. I think that's the main point, where it's a kind of meditation is a kind of renunciation. We're saying, I'm going to give up looking at stuff. I'm going to give up talking. I'm going to give up wriggling. I'm just going to be here with my mind. And you have to have some faith that will lead to something fruitful, that will allow some depth to be revealed, which it might take a long time, but it will. And eventually, there's this journey where I was talking about the dhyanas at the start, where the name Zen comes from. Eventually, we find ourselves in dhyana. We find ourselves in these beautiful, tranquil, meditative states. One eventually leads on to the other. Even this, Bhante says, is not the actual enlightened mind. Even these superconscious meditative states, as different and as another order as they seem, they're actually mundane. And until we see the nature of the mind beneath those states, we're still in the realm of the mundane. But we're the mind that's I'm getting there. with the mind that's softened and open by being in meditation in that way, that clinging is much more subtle. The need to perceive, the need to be a self is much more attenuated. From that state, we can see actually the nature of mind, and that will release us from self-clinging. So, and here Bhante says this is the kind of mind, he calls it the absolute mind. It's not subject as opposed to object, nor can itself be the object of thought. Yeah, so polarities are dispensed with completely. Rather, it is pure, brilliant, and transparent awareness within which the distinction of subject and object does not exist. The goal of meditation has now been reached. Reality has been seen. In direct pointing to the mind, Zen has pointed to reality, to enlightenment, to Buddhahood. Okay, so we'll leave it there. We've got more to go. We'll do that next week. We'll look at the final phrase. We've pointed directly to the mind with an unwavering determination, dispensed with all extraneous mental debris. We've seen the luminous nature of mind. And then next week we're going to see into our own nature and realise Buddhahood. Yeah, and I'll hand that on to someone else to teach. Okay, let's finish there, and we'll, when you're ready, leave the shrine room and help put away the mats and cushions.
Thank you.